Well, welcome everybody. Really delighted you can join us to hear about the show, which, as Rachel was saying, has only just opened. So my thoughts on it are very provisional and I'm sure may change over time. But I thought it would be useful today at the outset of the exhibition to give a little bit of context for how it's come about, talk about the reasons why we chose to work with this particular artist, Cathy Wilkes, and then give you just a little sense of what's in that exhibition. It's on until the end of September, so plenty of time for those of you in Glasgow or nearby to come and see it, maybe see it more than once if you would like, because I think there's a lot to reflect on and think about in the show. So I'm going to try and keep this relatively brief and straightforward and talk you through how the Cathy Wilkes exhibition has come about. And the first most important thing to acknowledge in that regard is that it's been made possible through a commissioning partnership with Imperial War Museums. And IWM approached us a couple of years ago now with an amazing invitation to be part of a UK-wide project to commission artists to make works responding to histories of war and conflict. And this, of course, is close to their own remit. IWM has supported official war artists over many important conflicts, and incredible works of art have been made as a result. But in particular, our project is connected to the First World War centenary and the project 1418 Now, which took place between 2014 and 2018, and which featured works like the remarkable work that Jeremy Geller made, We're Here Because We're Here, a public performance event, unannounced and unframed as an artwork in which a number of people appeared in public spaces across Britain on the centenary of the first day of the Somme and effectively became like ghosts of that past haunting our present, just appearing in public space, occasionally gathering and singing. So this is indicative of the really bold, open, original way that IWM and 1480 Now approached these commissions. And so it was, incredibly exciting to be given the chance to do something in a similar vein. And it's a challenge and a responsibility also because of how important these histories are. But it wasn't tied, as 1418 Now was, to a particular conflict. We were given the opportunity to work with an artist of our choosing in any way that might explore these kinds of histories. And before I come on to talk about Cathy Wilkes' work specifically, I just wanted to talk about, I suppose, things that we haven't done and explain why, as a result, Cathy's work maybe felt particularly pertinent. So in the immediate vicinity of the Hunterian Art Gallery, if you go into Kelvin Grove Park and its environs, you can quickly encounter the kinds of war memorials that sprung up all over Britain after the Boer War, after the First World War, after the Second World War. And very often in these, we see representations of acts of soldiering or of soldiers at rest, maybe tombs, mausoleum-like structures. Of course, Britain has many, many of these. Every city, every town, every village has them, particularly in relation to the First World War with mass mobilization. And I think it felt from the perspective of the 21st century that these things already abound. There was not necessarily a need for us to think about adding a monument or a memorial or to respond to particular national histories of conflict. They're very well served in our immediate environment. So we can see the university in the background of the Highland Light Infantry Memorial. If you go to the monument to Lord Roberts, top of Kelvin Grove Park, you see the university and the Hunterian from there. They're plentiful, as are these sites of remembrance, such as Glasgow's cenotaph, opened in 1924, or maybe most well known in the UK, Edward Lutyens' cenotaph in London, with its inscription to the glorious dead. And it felt like these sites of national remembrance are, again, very well established. They fulfill their function. They mark not only the conflicts they originally created to remember, but many since. And of course, we're here, the day after the 80th anniversary of D-Day, you need very little reminder of how important, how political these acts of remembrance are. But they take place on a national stage, and they have a certain register, an official register. They are state monuments and memorials and state rituals of remembrance that are embodied in these particular kinds of things. And when IWM approached us with this very generous offer of co-commissioning a project, and I thought about what might be a way that would make sense for the Hunterian, and from the perspective of 2021, which is when I think we had those first conversations, not long before, we had had some incredible works on paper, prints and drawings by the German artist Cathy Wilkes on show in our gallery. They're part of our permanent collection. Included works like this, 3 Studies of a Lamenting Woman. And those of you who know Kollwitz's work will be aware that she was incredibly closely affected, intimately affected by war. Her son Peter was killed in the First World War, and these studies of grief became, in a way, like prefigurations of the work she would later make in relation to her own grief for her son. Maybe the most extraordinary of which is now situated as an enlarged version posthumously made by another artist, Harold Hacker, in the Neue Wache in Berlin, in which we see this act of maternal care for a dead son, of course, made in the 1930s in a very particular set of political circumstances, anathema to Kollwitz's own politics, and in the wake of her own loss of her son. So I suppose as an intuition or an inclination at the very start of thinking about this process, I wondered if there was an artist whose sensitivity, emotional range and depth working today might be in some way a parallel to the work that Kollwitz made. It's not national in its iconography or in its implicit meaning, and yet it takes the measure in some way of these national events of war and conflict in particular, through their impact on individual lives, on individual bodies, and through states of emotional extremis. And I think also, just to say, in the background of this were certain ideas that I'm interested in anyway as an academic, and which we could think about in a number of ways, but I'm going to just paraphrase those here in relation to a couple of interventions made in the debate around how we remember the Second World War, and not only the Holocaust, but also the conflict that took place then. Interventions that were made by the British-based but German-born writer W.G. Sebald. And in a contentious text, certainly in his native Germany, called On the Natural History of Destruction, Sebald made a really important claim, or rather raised a very important question. In thinking about something that had not been registered in a national history, which was the experience of bombardment that the German nation underwent during the Second World War. Growing up in the aftermath of the Nazi government and the Second World War, Sebald was incredibly aware of the silence of the previous generation about these matters, both the events of the Holocaust and their complicity in it in all kinds of ordinary ways, but also the silence, maybe a guilty silence, about what it meant to be subject to bombardment. And I've highlighted in this longer passage from this text on the natural history of destruction 2 points that we can reel off statistics about the bombardment of German cities and towns. But as Sebald says, we do not grasp what it all actually meant. And then, as he says later on, it never became an experience capable of public decipherment. So the sense that in all the commemorations of war that we see around us, there are things that are still unexpressed, that are not grasped, that have not been deciphered. That felt like a really important question to consider too. And this leads me more directly onto Cathy Wilkes' work, sorry. An amazing short description in an interview that Sebald gave with the American scholar Michael Silverblatt, where he talks about a certain effect of atmosphere and of personal biographical detail, imagined detail, in his last novel, Austerlitz. Austerlitz describes a man who is discovering gradually his own forgetting of the experience of coming into Britain on the Kindertransport. So the experience of the loss of his entire childhood world, which he's literally not remembered, and is recovering gradually through the events that are relayed in the book Austerlitz. And just talking about this and the way he writes and the way he approaches these huge subjects, Sebald said the following: "You know, there is, in Virginia Woolf, this wonderful example of her description of a moth coming to its end on a window pane somewhere in Sussex. It's a short passage," he says. There's no reference to the battlefields of the Somme, but one knows as a reader of Virginia Woolf that she was greatly perturbed by the First World War, by its aftermath, by the damage that it did people's souls, the souls of those who got away and naturally of those who perished. So I think that a subject which at first glance seems quite removed from the undeclared concern of a book can encapsulate that concern. And this idea that Virginia Woolf's attention to a moth dying on a window pane and the way in which she evokes it, the way in which she describes this situation, could in a way be carrying all of these other concerns about what war had done to Woolf, to her brother, to other people she knew, and so on. That felt like a really important thing, different than the memorial, the monument, the national stage, and so on. And thinking about Colvitts, thinking about these ideas from Sebald, I wondered if the Glasgow-based, Belfast-born artist Cathy Wilkes would undertake this commission. And Cathy has made an extraordinary body of work over many years now that often draws together sculptures, found objects, paintings, and environments to create works whose subjects seem to be very fundamental human experiences, say of maternal care or of grief and bereavement. They often involve sculptures that take human form, that populate the environment she creates, but which also seem in some way held in their own very private worlds. So you can see here that sometimes costume elements in Cathy's work might have alluded to soldiering, for example, but in a very different way than the kind of war memorials we saw earlier, with the materials of everyday life, of her own life, of other people's lives around. And as her work has developed, these kinds of sculptures have more and more become about wordless kind of experiences, fundamental experiences that might take place in domestic milieu. So this is a extraordinary sculpture from 2012. You see one figure attending to another. They're all absolutely connected in a world of very basic kind of experiences. And from a year later, and this was shown both at Tramway in Glasgow and then later in a touring retrospective that Cathy had that went to Linz, to Mönchengladbach, and also to Tate Liverpool. This work, Possil at Last, with disinterred fragments of pottery from the Possil area of Glasgow, and this bowed figure who seems to carry an enormous weight of suffering or grief through very, very simple formal means, real clothing on a skeletal kind of armature with child attendants. And I suppose for lots of reasons, the emotional weight of Cathy's work and its ability to kind of conjure experiences that might be beyond verbal expression has, put me in mind of Käthe Kollwitz and what she was doing in her works on paper and her sculpture a century previously. And they're works that can take you aback sometimes by their very direct emotional expression, as here, this small textile figure laid directly on the industrial surface of the floor of Tramway on the south side of Glasgow. So over the last couple of years, Cathy has been thinking about how to undertake this commission. Brilliantly, she said yes to the invitation, for which we're incredibly grateful, and she has thrown herself into the process of working out what it would mean for her to respond to war and conflict in a meaningful way. And the way that she has approached that, I think, has been really to to return to some fundamental experiences or contexts of her own, not to make work about those, but to take them as a guide in some way. This is from a show she had during the process of preparations for the exhibition at the Hunterian, but this took place at the gallery she works with in Glasgow, the Modern Institute in Osborne Street, with a very ghostly sculpted form, found objects and paintings. And accompanying this show was an artist statement, which I think is a very useful cue maybe for what Cathy's done at the Hunterian. And she speaks in the first person here. In my street, we lived in a blockade of inimical forces. One moved quietly and carefully so as not to disturb anything. I wanted to be as small as an atom, even a lepton or a quark. I am an epitome and a subsistent operator. I knew I was the oppressor, so how can I be the liberator? In proximity to the violence and death, propinquity resulted in perversion. So much talk on that line and all the worry about it buried us all. We weren't used to looking at things in what you would call the light. And so Cathy, who was born in Belfast in 1966, is thinking here quite directly about the experience of growing up in a community that's subject to violence. And one of the gestures that she's made in the show is to rethink war and conflict in terms of more general exposure to the risk of violence or of actual violence, how it pervades homes and lives and experiences in a way that this text describes, and the idea of trying to avoid that, to shrink oneself down, but also being in proximity in relation to it is really key. It plays out in our show in kind of remarkable ways. And I'm not going to show more than a couple of images of this exhibition at the Hunterian, but just to give you an idea of the work, one of the key elements is a sculpted figure who reels back on their heels and seems to bear marks of injury from a plastic bullet that projects from the gallery wall. And this relates in ways that are evident in the exhibition. If you look at the archival material, it's included there to something that happened to a woman in the early 1970s at the hands of the British Army in Belfast. The whole show thinks about what it means for violence to intrude into a domestic space, a space of ordinary lives, and how a community might make sense of or respond to that intrusion. But there's one element of this work I just wanted to draw out and suggest by way of conclusion. This is very tentative because I haven't resolved it for myself or thought it through fully, but what is described sculpturally in this instant is a moment in which one person, in this case a British soldier, but it needn't be, it could be someone in any other situation of confrontation, of violence, but where one person is unarmed and one is not, but they're face to face. This was an incident that happened at close range between one person and another. And what Cathy has spoken about elsewhere of fascination in her work with details of conscience, with how it's possible for certain things to transpire. I think that really is crucial to this work. And I've been thinking about it quite a lot through this text, a remarkable text by the theorist Judith Butler that was written at just in the aftermath of the first Gulf War. So after 9/11, after the American military actions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And she thinks about why it is that in our world, some lives are more grievable than others, why some lives count and others do not, why the violence that some people are subject to doesn't count as violence. And this is important in relation to this work for me, partly because the rubber bullet is a sanctioned form of violence. It's considered non-lethal, even though it can do enormous damage. In this case, it blinded the person subject to it in both eyes, changed their lives fundamentally in a moment. And in this book, ultimately, Judith Butler is arguing that what we all have in common as human beings is a certain precariousness, a vulnerability to others, and that our ethical obligation to each other could be described ultimately but as the exposure of these vulnerabilities to each other. And she uses the work of another philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, to talk about this. And he writes about how the situation of being face to face with another person being kind of underpinned somehow by the biblical injunction, thou shalt not kill. The meaning of the human face for him, as we encounter it face to face, vis-a-vis another, is thou shalt not kill. And yet, of course, we know that, as this sculpture relays, that it doesn't prevent it from happening. It's implicit for Levinas in that. And Butler writes really kind of amazingly about Levinas in this fragment. I'm just going to read you one short passage from it. She says, in an essay entitled Peace and Proximity, Levinas makes plain that the face is not exclusively a human face. To explain this, he refers to Vasily Grossman's text, Life and Fate, which he describes as, quote, the story of the families, wives, and parents of political detainees traveling to the Lubyanka in Moscow for the latest news. A line is formed at a counter, a line where one can only see the backs of others. A woman waits her turn. She had never thought the human back could be so expressive and could convey states of mind in such a penetrating way. Persons approaching the counter had a particular way of craning their neck and their back, their raised shoulders with shoulder blades like springs which seemed to cry, sob, and scream. And Butler goes on to paraphrase this and respond to it. Here the term face operates as a catachresis. Face describes the human back, the craning of the neck, the raising of the shoulder, blades like springs. And these bodily parts in turn are said to cry and to sob and to scream, as if they were a face, or rather a face with a mouth, a throat, or indeed just a mouth and throat, from which vocalizations emerge that do not settle into words. The face is to be found in the back and the neck, but it is not quite a face. I'll maybe leave that there, but in what Butler's describing, she's trying to think about other ways in which we come to this ethical encounter with others. It's not just looking people in the eye, but the expressiveness of their bodies in these situations, in a queue, in a home, could be face-like, could face us and address us. And in many ways, I think what Cathy Wilkes has done in this show is think about what it means as a human being to be faced with violence. And the exhibition is a remarkable, bold response to a very complicated invitation to think about these issues. So I would just like to take the opportunity to thank Cathy again for the way in which she's approached this, which has been really inspiring to see.